Greetings, comrades, and welcome to something I've always wanted to do, but never actually got around to doing, which is a proper tier list. And today, we are going to be doing a Warhammer 3 Immortal Empire tier list. And I've been playing a ton. I've had the opportunity to play every single race, not every single lord yet, but I have enough experience, I think, to really get a feel of which are the best and worst factions so far in the campaign. So we are going to go in order from worst to best, and most of these factions will be ranked on power. However, I will have a little bit of leeway for fun. Generally speaking, a lot of the time, the two go hand in hand. And we're going to start off with the worst faction in F tier, and F tier is for factions which basically have, I think, weak armies and weak campaigns. And starting things off with what I think is the worst faction in the game, and it really pains me to say this as a fan of the faction, and that is Nurgle. They struggled in the base game, and unfortunately they continue to struggle now with the release of Immortal Empires. Kugath's start is, I think, significantly more enjoyable than in the Realms of Chaos campaign. It's just an exceedingly slow start to get to the fun, and a real grind because you start next to Helman Gorst, who has a real tendency to explode quickly and become a real thorn in your side. And of course, Nurgle's army still remains pretty slow and weak, very vulnerable to missile attacks and magic attacks. So as a result, you have to spend a lot of your time managing your healing spells to keep all your units alive. So yeah, unfortunately the Plague Father tends to get outclassed by other factions pretty easily, and I think he's going to need a lot of love before he can stop languishing at the bottom of the tier list. Moving on to Slaanesh, and I am a little bit biased against Slaanesh just because their playstyle doesn't really jive very well with me. So I have difficulty getting success with their armies, but not only that, they have just one start in the campaign, and that's right next to all the High Elves, who happen to be probably the best counter to Slaanesh. I don't know, maybe some people will disagree with that, but I think they're a pretty good counter to Slaanesh personally. So you, again, have to grind to get out of the gate. I do think Slaanesh is better than Nurgle, though, because I find the campaign tools and mechanics that Slaanesh offers to be far more useful than what Nurgle has on tap. So Slaanesh struggles with both their unit roster and their campaign start, making them, I think, one of, again, the worst factions available in Immortal Empires. Moving on to the last faction in F tier, and that is going to be the Demons of Chaos. And maybe I'm being too unfair to the Demons of Chaos. It's just when you compare them to the Warriors of Chaos, they seem significantly lacking, both in terms of the tools that they have available and their economic strength. Where the Warriors of Chaos have the vassal system, they have dark fortresses that have a strong economic building chain. The demons have none of that, and in comparison, they always feel like you never have enough armies to really get the job done. And as a result, you never really get that feeling of being the unending tide of chaos that you do with a lot of these other chaos factions. However, considering that they have access to the entire chaos roster, they get the top spot on the bottom tier. So before we move on to D tier, here's the fun look at the F tier roster, and now we can move into D tier. And the thing about these D tier choices is that I think that their armies are still powerful and good, but they are severely hampered by their campaign mechanics, to the point where it can become borderline unfun to play these factions sometimes, or they'll just get left in the dust in the late game in comparison to other ones. So fittingly, starting off D tier is the Dwarves, and the issue with the Dwarves is not at all their army. Their army, I think, remains powerful, with a wide variety of enjoyable to use siege and gunpowder units. The issue is just the Book of Grudges, which needs to be retooled for Immortal Empires. And maybe I am just an idiot. That is definitely a possibility. But I am just really struggling with maintaining my Book of Grudges meter, which always seems to grow wildly out of control, and I'm almost always fighting it as much as I'm fighting the enemies around me. So honestly, if they were just to retool this system, the dwarves would easily launch up in the tier system, in my opinion. However, as they stand, are one of the least fun and least powerful factions on the map. Next, we're moving on to the ogres, who again have a really powerful unit roster. But the fact you can only have a limited number of camps and your settlements can only be upgraded to tier 3 means that in the long game you're going to struggle to keep up with a lot of these other factions we're going to be talking about as we move up the tier list. And because you've only got so many camps, which really means so many armies, you're going to struggle to cover all your territory. So again, a good faction, which I think will shoot up the tier list if they just have a little bit of tweaks around the edges. Lastly, to round out the D tier, we have another choice, which pains me, and that is the poor Empire. I know, heresy and all that, but the Empire really struggles from the elector count system, which used to not be an issue in Mortal Empires in Warhammer 2. However, now with so many more threats facing the Empire, your various elector counts are going to get chewed up and spat out faster than you can do anything about it, which is just going to crater your authority and as a result make everything a lot more difficult for you. The one nice thing the Empire does have, which allows it to be at the bottom of D tier, is have a couple lords which can escape the mechanics which bind them, and those are of course Volkmar and Marcus Wolfhart. However, I believe both of those are DLC characters, and it feels kind of crappy to have to buy DLC characters to unlock the fun of a faction. So I'm hesitant to include those. And personally, of all the factions in D tier, I think the Empire has the most robust and best army. So once again, once they go back and deal with some of these older mechanics, I think the Empire will be a lot more enjoyable. Now, before we move to the next tier, here's a look of where we are. And now, C tier they're just average, right? They're not terrible by any stretch of the imagination, but they're not really lighting the world on fire, either metaphorically or physically in their cases. And starting off in C tier, we have Zeech, who is in a lot better place in comparison to the rest of his demon compatriots because his army is excellent. Not only that, his campaign mechanics are also quite a bit of fun to use. However, Zeech suffers from the same issue that I think all the demon factions suffer from, which is just a really crappy economy. Demons struggle with bouncing the budget. Who knew? So while the armies you do have will be very good and fun to use, plus I forgot to mention that Kairos himself is an excellent lord, you just won't have very many of those armies. Next in C tier is Bretonnia, and to me, they exemplify the perfect C tier faction in the sense that they are exactly average. I feel that in no cases do they excel, but in no cases are they terrible either. Plus, their campaign mechanics as a whole definitely feel very standard Total War to me personally. So if you're just looking for a more standard Total War experience, particularly if medieval Total War was your favorite Total War, go with Bretonnia. They're a solid choice. Next on the list is Kislev. I find it similar to Bretonnia in the sense that they are a very average faction right now. Not great in anything, not terrible in anything either. Also, their campaign offers a much more standard Total War experience. On a personal level, I enjoy the Kislevian armies more than the Bretonnian ones. I enjoy the emphasis on the hybrid units. Plus, I obviously dig the Eastern European aesthetic and vibe. So that's why I'm putting Kislev above Bretonia, even though in my mind they are in C tier for similar reasons. So with that, we're going to move on to our last C tier faction, and that is going to be the last demon tier faction, and that is of course the blood god himself, Khorne. So I think he's a little bit lower. I can definitely bump him up to B tier. The only reason I kept him in C tier is because A, I thought I was getting too many factions in B tier, and B, he has the same economic problem as the other demon factions. So while going ham wild as Skarbrand, particularly in his start location where you start around a lot of enemies, is a great time. And you'd think as a result you'd be spawning stack after stack of units. However, again, going back to that upkeep, going back to that economy, if you are spawning all these stacks, you're probably not going to be able to afford to keep them around for very long. Though honestly, their army is extremely powerful, so this is one of the things that I suppose keeps them back from being a very dominant faction. That being said, poor Skarbrand's economic illiteracy prevent him from truly breaking in to the top tier of our factions. So now we move into B tier, but once again, before we move on, here is a look at our tier list so far. Now, moving into B tier, we have a choice which surprised me personally, and that is the Beastmen. I hadn't even bothered playing the Beastmen when they initially got the rework. In fact, with Immortal Empires, this is the first time I had played the Beastmen as a faction since the DLC came out, and I enjoyed myself. Even more than Skarbrand, when I'm playing the Beastmen factions, I really get this feeling of being just a wandering force of destruction. Just roaming into one province, burning everything down, and then moving on to the next. Not caring about your research or your economy or any of that nonsense. You're just a wandering herd of destruction. And it's almost cathartic in a sense. My biggest drawback with the Beastmen as a faction is that most of their high tier units are locked behind very high levels of Marks of Ruination, which can be a bit of a grind to get through. That being said though, the Beastmen are all around very enjoyable faction with a very powerful army. So I think they're a good choice to start off B tier. Next is another surprising one, and that is Norsika. And this faction mainly gets into B tier because of how easy it is to build up a very powerful army with a pretty sizable economic backbone. On a personal level though, I don't find Norsika's army that much fun to play. However, it's still quite a capable army, and because all you need to do to get another tribe into your faction is just defeat their leader, you can confederate Norsika at insane speeds. And then from there, just pump out swarm after swarm of Norsican hordes, and you'll be able to overrun the old world easily. So while on a personal level, not my favorite faction, I can acknowledge the fact that now in Immortal Empires, they get very powerful very quickly. Moving on to the next faction, which is going to be the Vampire Coast. I think all of the undead factions have gotten a huge buff for Immortal Empires, and unfortunately, the Vampire Coast is probably the weakest of all the undead factions, which is a shame to me personally because they're my favorite undead faction, but coming in at B tier ain't too shabby. So what holds them back in comparison to the other undead factions, and that is in my opinion the fact that they focus on hordes rather than settling and taking territory. And I don't know, maybe this is just kind of ingrained into the fabric of the game, but it just seems that horde-focused factions cannot keep up with settlement-focused factions. But if you're looking for a campaign where you are very difficult to be defeated, the AI struggles to attack a lot of the Vampire Coast homelands, and you want to relive those Pirates of the Caribbean fantasy where you lead a horde of undead ghouls across the seas, raping and pillaging all you come across, the Vampire Coast really nails it on that front. especially with the new Immortal Empires map, which has much more in terms of waterways. Of course, they have sea lanes, navigable rivers, just a ton of opportunity to wreak havoc. Alright, moving on to our next D tier faction, we have the High Elves. And again, these next two factions, I think you could make an argument to be A tier, but for me, they are just on that cusp, very much so on the cusp between A tier and B tier. So what makes the High Elves so great? Well, they have an excellent roster filled with powerful missile units, which still have a tendency to dominate over melee units, particularly if used properly. Almost all their factions have good starting positions, but particularly the High Elf faction itself starts with the perfect centralized position where you can go anywhere. Not to mention, it's very difficult for any enemies to come and attack you on your little island. The High Elves don't really have any crazy campaign mechanics. Again, a pretty standard Total War campaign, but they boast a solid economy overall, and particularly those High Elves, they start in a place where it's very difficult for the AI to come and raid and burn down your settlements, so you can get your economic engine running without any interruptions. I mean, honestly, there's not a lot more to say about the High Elves. Just a really good, really solid faction. And in that same vein, we move on to the last B tier faction, which is going to be Grand Cathay. And the reason I put Grand Cathay over the High Elves is that I think that their economy is better, particularly once you lock down the Harmony system. And I think their army is slightly better. Again, I think it's that Harmony system, which is a lot easier to implement in battles and gives you a nice passive buff. Grand Cathay also has a good start in the far east of the map, meaning they have no enemies which can come from behind really and flank them. Once whatever lord you choose unites Grand Cathay, you can go anywhere. You can push into the wastes, you can send out Imperial treasure fleets to Lustria, you have tons of options. And with that, Grand Cathay tops off the B tier. There are 8 factions left going into the top 2 tiers, 4 in each. But before we move on, once again, here's where we have been. And I would consider all the factions in this top tier extremely powerful, though what really is separating the A tier from the S tier in this case are the factions that I think are just stupid powerful, maybe arguably overpowered. In any case, without further ado, let's start off A tier with the first faction, and that is the Dark Elves. And it was a struggle deciding which was the better of the two, the Dark Elves or the High Elves, because honestly I think the High Elves do have a better economy and a slightly better roster overall, but what really edged out the Dark Elves in the overall calculation was the fact that, for whatever reason, their army just seems like it hard counters so many different things in the game, particularly armored units and large units, which most factions struggle to counter, especially in the early game. So when you play the Dark Elves, you feel exceptionally powerful. Factions and units that may have given you trouble previously, all of a sudden you're cutting through them like a hot knife through butter. Now for our next A tier faction, I do admit I might be a little bit fanboyish here, but it's the Skaven. The Skaven have come a long way since their inception in Warhammer 2, and in my opinion remain one of the best factions in the game. Though honestly, I do feel like the true potential of the Skaven as an army and a faction are locked behind its DLCs, which is a real shame in my opinion. However, even without those, I do think the Skaven are a great army. When it comes to snowballing potential, the Skaven are one of the best factions for this. The main reason for that being is that all buildings generate some form of income. So whatever building you're capturing will get you money. Whatever upgrade you're building will get you money. And if you happen to have the luxury of a lot of food, not only are you going to get a numerous amount of benefits for your Skaven, you will also have the opportunity to upgrade any captured settlement quickly and easily, further adding to that snowball effect. That being said though, I do think the Skaven struggle in the early game to get their footing, and particularly until they can upgrade a few tier levels to get access to their best weapons. At their core, the Skaven are a meat shield race, where the weak units give their lives in defense of the strong ones, which are going to do the overwhelming majority of the killing. But as is their nature, the Skaven come with a lot of underhanded tricks. Their most prominent one being their access to summons, which they can spawn anywhere. And I find few things less satisfying in Total War than summoning a horde of clan rats onto my enemy's unguarded artillery pieces. So anyway, in summary, Skaven, great army, great campaign mechanics, great long game, however, struggle in the early game. Next up on our list is Cetra and his boys. The Tomb Kings do not serve. They remain one of the best factions in the game. However, I do think they suffer a little bit in Immortal Empires. In my opinion, in Mortal Empires and Warhammer 2, the Tomb Kings were an S-tier race. No longer, I feel, the main reason being the fact that you can't field unlimited armies definitely hurts you a lot more in Immortal Empires. But come on, your units have no upkeep. It's so powerful. Particularly as you start to get those very powerful units with no upkeep. I do think a lot of people have been underrating the Tomb Kings in terms of their power on the campaign map because they have been playing as Cetra, who definitely has a harder start now. However, in comparison, I feel all of the other Tomb Kings seem to have an easier start, particularly Arkin the Black, who now seems to dominate in every game I play. So if you have been struggling as the Tomb Kings a little bit, try playing another Lord besides Cetra, and you'll notice they remain to be a pretty powerful army. Again, in the late game, I do feel they really fall behind because they can't muster up an infinite amount of stacks like a lot of the other races. But if they could do that, I honestly think they'd be S tier, no problem. Alright, and now on to the last A tier faction, and that is the Lizardmen. Currently, the Lizardmen feel like a really good faction. They feel like they're in a fantastic place. I think they excel in almost all quadrants. Maybe they're weakest on the economic front, but I think their armies are so good. They have so many great tools available, plus their dinosaurs are always spectacular. They dominate both on the battle map, and for whatever reason they seem to have a crazy good auto-resolve score. I think that the Lizardmen are probably the best faction that don't feel really broken. Plus the fact that they have so many lords that have such a wide array of starting locations makes the Lizardmen one of the few factions you can play and legitimately see every single corner of the Immortal Empire's map. So yeah, honestly, not too much more to say about the Lizardmen. All around, exactly what you would expect an A-tier faction to be. Top marks in pretty much every single department. And with that, we are out of A tier and we move into S tier. And we're about to see the cream of the crop in terms of Immortal Empires. We have 4 factions left. And before we move on, let's once again check out our tier list before we unlock the final tier. And as I alluded to before, I think that these factions are borderline overpowered. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were some nerfs to some of these guys in the near future. So with that being said, our first S tier faction is the Wood Elves. So remember back when I said that the Dark Elves usually had the hard counter to everything that was tough in the game? Usually that tough thing is the Wood Elves. I've always struggled to fight these guys, and whenever I play as them, it always seems to be a cakewalk. What I think is so potent about them is the fact that A, they have probably the best missile units in the game, and missile units by and large are still pretty overpowered. And 2, they have access to armored units very early on in the form of dryads and treemen and so on and so forth. So most likely your missile units are going to shred the enemy missile units, and your infantry, particularly again if you have dryads or treekin or treemen, they're just going to completely destroy the early game units for almost every single faction. the thing which really prevents the Wood Elves from being the best of the best is the fact that, once again, they're not a faction very much so focused on taking and holding territory. You know, the fact that they can only really build outposts prevents them from building up the economy they need to truly steamroll everything. Still, all in all, undoubtedly one of the best factions in the game, a ton of fun to play as, a huge pain in the ass to fight against. And the third best faction in the game, in my opinion, is the Vampire Counts. The Vampire Counts have undergone a substantial overhaul for Immortal Empires, skyrocketing them from one of the worst factions in the game to one of the best. And a lot has been said about Hellman Gorst and his campaign, which I can say is a ton of fun, and his fully upgraded zombie horde is ridiculous. It's not just him that are overpowered. All the Vampire Counts are extremely potent forces to be reckoned with. So what makes them so powerful? First off is their upgrades to how they recruit units. In provinces where particularly large battles have happened and lots of people have died, if the Vampire Counts have the money, they can simply raise the dead from those battlefields. And not only that, the more people that have died in that province, the better the units will be. So if you wander into a province that has had a particularly gnarly battle, all of a sudden you can recruit the best units the Vampire Counts have to offer right out of the gate. No tech, no upgrades necessary, you just need the money to recruit them. And to back that up, the Vampire Counts have not one of the best economies in the game, but certainly a solid economy with good growth to back up the forces that you want to recruit. So with that in mind, they are now the number one faction to snowball out of control. Plus, I don't know if this is 100% confirmed or anything, but it certainly feels like vampiric corruption spreads much faster in this game than in Warhammer 2. So it makes taking ground as the Vampire Counts a lot better, in my opinion at least. You don't feel like it's that stop-start grind so much. You kind of feel like this ever slowly moving ball of death. The nice part here being is it never feels like you're losing momentum like you did in Warhammer 2. So yeah, Vampire Counts, extremely powerful, heavily buffed, definitely worth playing. All of their lords are very powerful, none of them are weak, so any of them is worth giving a try, especially if you're like me and hadn't really played around with the Vampire Counts since the first game. Oh boy, here we go, we're in the top 2 now. So, who's it gonna be? Well, coming in at number 2, it's going to be the Warriors of Chaos. So basically, with the Warriors of Chaos, just imagine that all of the complaints I had about the Demons of Chaos were just taken away. With the Warriors of Chaos, in comparison to the demonic factions, there is an extremely strong emphasis on vassalizing other factions. And this not only solves the problem of feeling like you don't have enough armies when you're playing as the demons, but not only that, these vassals pay you tribute, and if you're a lord like, say, Archaon the Everchosen, you're getting continual benefits with every single vassal that you're adding to your list. So these vassals, by and large, take care of that economic problem you were having as the demons. Then add on to the fact that the main building for the Warriors of Chaos, the various dark fortresses scattered throughout the map, have way better economic buildings than anything the demonic factions have access to. So it completely obliterates any of the flaws of the other chaotic factions. And in my opinion, you don't need the DLC, the Champions of Chaos, to enjoy this faction in any way, shape, or form. In my opinion, both Archaon and Be'lakor have better campaigns than any of the DLC champions. I'd only recommend you pick up the DLC if you really want to play, say, a Nurgle or Siege themed faction and not have to deal with all of the downsides from the mono god faction. Someone like Festus, in my opinion, feels a million times better to play than Kugath. And the last powerful thing the Warriors of Chaos have is a warband recruitment, which is somewhat similar to what the vampire counts have, where every province has a pool of warband recruits that you can instantly pull from and bring into your army. So this gives you a lot more leeway when venturing out from your home provinces, because you can raise a warband to defend it pretty easily if someone were to attack you. You can't do this as one of the demonic factions. So yeah, another faction that was down in the dumps and has been uplifted by the release of Immortal Empires. There's a lot to love about the Warriors of Chaos right now. And finally, we have come to the end of our list, and in my opinion, the best faction currently in Immortal Empires, and if you have been paying attention by the process of elimination, I'm sure you've guessed it by now. It is, of course, the Greenskins. So why the Greenskins? What makes the Greenskins so powerful right now? Well, there's a couple different things. First off, it goes without saying, the Wa mechanic. The Wa mechanic is extremely powerful. Once you get enough fervor to initiate a Wa, your armies are going to immediately get additional Wa stacks of units. And these are going to remain with you throughout the duration of the Wa. So whenever you feel like it, you can start a Wa and essentially double your entire standing armies for free. So yeah, very powerful. Of course, but wait, there's more, etc., etc. So right now, I would say that the Orcs probably have the best economy. Grand Cathay, I think, being the competitor to them. As the Greenskins, you can just get so much money so easily and quickly. The main thing you do is you, of course, sack settlements. You get additional income from sacking settlements. And once you actually take settlements, I think the Greenskins have the best green industrial building in the game. That is the pile of shiny stuff. It just generates you so much income, especially in comparison to any other building that any other faction has. Then of course there's the roster of the Greenskins itself, which I would say is one of the most solid and finely balanced rosters in the game. I would say the Greenskins have very few, if any, weaknesses when it comes to actual battles, and plenty of strengths, particularly their infantry, some of the best infantry in the game. And the cherry on top of this whole green sundae is their confederation system, which is very similar to the Norsican system, which allows you to gain confederations over factions very easily simply by beating their faction lord. So not only can you use this normally in a campaign to great effect, because usually Greenskin factions tend to be very powerful right now in Immortal Empires, probably given the fact there's such a powerful faction. In any case, you can actually take this a step further, and this may get patched out, so if you're watching this sometime in the distant future, sorry if this doesn't work anymore. If you're playing as a Greenskin faction and you enable the Greenskin endgame, you can beat the various leaders and confederate their stacks into your own faction, effectively making you the endgame boss. And currently, there's no other faction that can do this in Immortal Empires, so I think that little trick in and of itself should land the Greenskins as the top spot is the best faction right now in Immortal Empires. And without further ado, that actually brings me to the end of my first tier list ever. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was a ton of fun making it and getting to talk about all these different Warhammer factions. Agree? Disagree? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, this has been the Comrade, signing off, and you guys take care.